There's no way to avoid that. And then we present the text to a reader as the original text, and the poor reader doesn't know what's going on. I want you to always know what's going on when you read a translation. That's why we spent that time on chapter 1 with those multiple translations. So chapter 2. All the world knows beauty, but if that becomes beautiful, this becomes ugly. So when we characterize one thing as something that's beautiful, we're always characterizing something else as ugly. Beautiful and ugly are comparative terms. All the world knows good, but if that becomes good, this becomes bad. So once again, we like to evaluate things. This is the good car, this is the bad car. This is the good route to where I'm going, this is the bad route to where I'm going. This is good restaurant, this is a bad restaurant. When we do that, though, we take ourselves to be identifying an intrinsic property that one of them has, goodness or badness. The Tao Te Ching is emphasizing that all we're doing is comparison, and that comparison is always relative to our taste. And so what we do is we project our tastes into first a comparison and then an intrinsic attribution of value to things in the world, which by themselves, just as things in the world, have no value, positive or negative, whatsoever. The text continues. The coexistence of have and have not, the co-production of hard and easy, the correlation of long and short, the codependence of high and low. Here again, we have a series of extremes. In each case, we can find ourselves in cognitive circumstances where we see something and say, that's a tall tree, or that's a long road, or that's a short person. And we instinctively take ourselves to be noticing some property that that thing has all by itself. The Tao Te Ching here is trying to correct us and to say, first of all, what we're doing is actually engaged in a comparison, not an intrinsic characterization. But secondly, that comparison is not of things in the world that have got properties independent of our concerns, but rather a projection of our own concerns, of our own desires, as we saw in Book 1, on the world in order to create the dichotomy, which then becomes the fallacious intrinsic attribution. So we move from a primordial ground to a this and that with this property and that property instinctively, and in doing so, we distance ourselves from reality. Next line is lovely. The correspondence of note and noise. This is kind of nice. If you think about listening to music up against background noise, so suppose you're out in the park and you're listening to a concert, but there's also children playing in the background and dogs barking and cars going, and you are trying to distinguish the notes the band is playing from the noise. Notice what you're doing. You're listening to this vast array of sound in the world around you, undifferentiated, all coming in, and you are deciding that's what I'm going to pay attention to. Now, you think, okay, I heard music, and the music was playing against a background of kids and dogs and cars. But you weren't. What you were hearing was a vast array of sound, and you chose to fasten on the music as the foreground and the rest as the background. The Tao Te Ching here is urging you, pay attention to the background. The background is there too, and part of the world that you live in. The coordination of first and last is endless. Thus, the sage performs effortless deeds and teaches wordless lessons. This coordination, this fact that foreground and background are always correlative to one another, that things do not appear to us as objects, things don't appear to us as characterized unless there's a background against which they appear, that notes don't appear except against a background of things that aren't notes, even silence, forces us to come to grips with the fact that we actually are taking a natural world with which we can live in harmony and reconstructing it as an artificial world with which it's difficult to live in harmony. Notice the opposite here to the Confucian view. So the sage performs effortless deeds and teaches wordless lessons. Means that the sage, the Taoist ideal person, in paying attention to the background as well as the foreground, gives up the effort of distinguishing foreground from background, and is able, therefore, to recover a spontaneous engagement with the entire matrix of world in which he exists, rather than only resonating to those small items that he chooses as placed in the foreground. Continues, he doesn't start all the things he begins. He doesn't presume on what he does. That is, the sage recognizes that many of the actions, the Taoist sage, in which he's involved, didn't begin with him. He is one moment in the history of a very long causal process. He himself, or she herself, isn't somehow an object against a background, a self against a lot of other, who initiates actions that are kind of unique, but rather a participant in a vast array of processes, a nature with which we're in harmony whether we like it or not. He doesn't claim what he achieves. That is, I recognize that when I think there's something I've done, it's actually the recognition of the fact that that achievement is the consequence of the confluence of a vast causal network of which I'm only one part. Imagine this, for instance. You're a member of a team or an organization, and you've got a piece of a project. Maybe you're trying to develop a proposal for a client, or maybe you're trying to write a legal brief with a team of people. And you get to the end and you say, aha, I've done it. I've written it, I've composed it. And you tend to think that way. Or you're driving to somebody's house and you say, I got here. And you say, I've achieved it. The Taoist is pointing out that when you've done that, you've placed yourself in the foreground and everybody else in the background. In the case of writing the brief or preparing the proposal, you've forgotten about all of your colleagues. You've forgotten about the library. You've forgotten about all the textbooks that helped you. You've forgotten about the teachers who taught you how to do that. When you drive from here to there and you say, I drove to her house, you forget that somebody had to build that car, that somebody had to maintain the roads, that other drivers had to not crash into you. That achievement isn't something you've accomplished alone, but what you have done is extracted yourself into a foreground from a background that you've then deprecated, and by doing that, you've distanced yourself from reality. And this chapter concludes, and because he makes no claim, that is, because he doesn't claim this kind of primacy, this kind of ontological specialness in the world, he suffers no loss. That is, he doesn't have to be attached to these things, and so that if things go wrong, we recognize it's not something that happened to me, it's just the way the world is. Compare the Stoics on this, and you'll see a really nice resonance. So we've got a bunch of really nice themes, Taoist themes, that come out of chapter 2. We've got this idea of relativity as important as opposed to things having absolute properties, long and short, good and bad. The idea that values are all connected to one another and that they're relative to our preferences. They're not things that are externally real. There's no privileged pole in any of these binaries. When we see something as beautiful, that doesn't mean it's better. It means we like it more. When we value some food as good and other as bad, it doesn't mean that there's something special about it. It tells us something about us. And if we can come to recognize this, we can come to interact with the world through Wu Wei, effortlessly, spontaneously, without calculated thought, without attributing these abstract properties to other things, and without distinguishing ourselves as special within that matrix. So this is a nice beginning into Taoism. What we've done today is we've talked a bit about the relationship between Taoism and Confucianism, a bit about this complex issue of the many meanings of Tao and of what the Tao is a Tao of. And I hope we're beginning to see what's distinctive about the Taoist account of life. And that Book 1, chapters 1 and 2, have helped us through that. In our next lecture, we're going to get deeper into the Tao Te Ching and explore all of these themes in much more detail. And I hope you're enjoying this text as much as I am.